resolution is written up on the board for you. The United States military should reduce its presence in North Africa. I want to also thank the Army representatives for coming, the judges panel. It's really great to see all of you, and I think it's going to be a great debate today. And before we begin, obviously it's a pretty political motion, and we are both military teams, so we have to have the disclaimer that, of course, everything in this round is not the official views of either team or the military at large. And it's just a purely academic setting. And I guess we'll wait. I'll poke my head out, see if you can do this. Wait out there. Are the judges ready? Opponents ready? John and I think that every great military must always know when to use force and when to have a level of restraint. We think in North Africa, restraint is necessary, which is why John and I affirm the resolution, the United States military should reduce its presence in North Africa. Let's start by actually defining what North Africa is going to be geographically in this round. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, the geographic entity of North Africa has no single accepted definition, so it becomes a little more difficult to actually know what we're talking about. We think that for the most charitable, fair, and open debate today, we will include the broadest definition of North Africa, being all territory inside of and north of the Sahel Transitional Region. Essentially what this means is it's the top third of the African continent. Now let's contextualize the debate before we go into our formal arguments. According to NPR, on October 2017, U.S. military missions are underway in roughly 20 African countries, mostly in the northern third of the continent. After 4 servicemen were killed in Niger, people began to learn for the first time who we are actually up against and what our mission actually consists of in North Africa. According to Foreign Policy, 5 October 2017, the United States involvement is only slated to grow. This is the status quo, that we are on a track towards increased involvement within the region. Currently, we have about 6,000 servicemen on the continent as a whole, but the escalation is starting to rapidly pick up. We see, John and I, see this round, that we are at a crossroads right now. We are either going to continue to ramp up and become more and more involved in the continent, or we need to step away from the continent, and we need to show a level of restraint. Which is why we are going to provide the plan text. The United States military will withdraw from North Africa. What we think this really would look like is that the garrison troops and all operations will cease in North Africa. People will pack their bags and they will go to back to whatever garrison that they were formerly a part of. We think that this is a unique situation where we aren't going to be causing some type of power vacuum. It's not going to look like northern Iraq. We do have different entities in the region who already are fighting terrorism aside from the United States. We see groups like Mali, Chad, Niger, and Marathi, and the Burkina Faso nations are coming together under what's called the G5 group and have created an army to fight terrorism. We also see the AU and ECOWAS are starting to prove themselves within the region. Before we continue on to our formal arguments, yes, from the opposition.
How long will this withdrawal take?
We think it will just be standard. I'm not going to try and stand up here and pretend that I actually have the ability to plan out the withdrawal, but it's going to be as rapid as we can.
What would a standard withdrawal be?
I'm not honestly going to be able to tell you at this point. I'm not necessarily the best representative for that, but we think that what it would look like is a rapid withdrawal and dismantling of the forces.
Thank you.
Now, on to our formal arguments. Contention 1, mission creep. Oxford Dictionary defines mission creep as a gradual shift in objectives during the course of a military campaign, often resulting in unplanned and long-term commitments. This is exactly what we think we are trying to avoid in the region. We think these are similar problems that the United States has faced when fighting other insurgencies and terrorist organizations. Is having some type of growing presence within a region without any clear goals. So there's no ability to have any type of exit strategy, and there's no ability to have a formal victory. What this looks like is a long, protracted war that ends up with more and more Americans coming home either injured or dead. And we think that this is a problem, especially when you don't have a formal mission laid out. According to Newsweek, October 2017, US AFRICOM started with just a handful of missions in 2008, but now has 6,000 troops deployed to the region, and we have a network of 46 military sites, official and non-official, that we operate out of. In addition to that, we see that largely there's been a downplay of what the US military role is actually in the region. We think that there's not a well-defined conflict with good guys or bad guys. According to Al Jazeera in July 7th of this year, in Mali, for example, the central government is not only fighting terrorists, but it's also fighting a rebel group called the Tuaregs. The US is caught in a web against multiple different, in multiple different conflicts with multiple different factions that sometimes are increasingly interrelated. We think that that makes it impossible for us to have some type of defined goals and choose some type of side in this war. We think that the end problem is that we are starting to invest in blood in the region. We saw that with the death of the 4 servicemen in Niger, that we have already invested in blood. And at a certain point, we will reach a tipping point. And the US public will be uncomfortable with just leaving behind the region once we invest a certain level of blood within the region. We think that that's a problem, because that's going to be a blank check on our military to allow for us to get increasingly involved in the region without any type of end goal. Now let's move on to our second contention, fueling terrorism. What we see here is that these conflicts that we're involved in are regional conflicts. If you actually look at the actors that we're fighting, like Boko Haram, for example, they have no interest in coming over and striking the United States. They are only interested in the regional conflicts themselves. According to David Kilcullen in his book, The Accidental Guerrilla, he argues that most of these people terrorists recruit have limited aims and sometimes legitimate grievances, and are fighting us because we are in their space, not because they wish to invade ours. But what he further argues is by our presence in the region gives them a reason to come over to the United States. We're seen as a foreign group there. We're seen as an outsider. And it is much more likely to recruit an individual to fight alongside your neighbor, like Boko Haram, rather than fight alongside the United States or be peaceful with the United States, especially when they're seen as an outsider. The second part of this argument is that the US presence has actually increased recruitment, we believe. According to The Nation, when analyzing the US Army War College report in 2000 saying on the African security environment, they found no terrorist activities outside of Somalia within the region. After billions of US dollars and 2 decades of involvement, we have seen nothing but an increase in instability. Terrorist groups like Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, and Al-Shabaab have become common names when discussing Africa. We find that US activity in Africa to be counterproductive, or in the worst case scenario, ineffective. This is because it's a vulnerable populace. According to the World Bank, poverty rates in the northern Iraq region are estimated to be between 30 to 60% of the population. According to Christian Science Monitor News, UN studies have found that military responses may be one of the key drivers to radicalization in fragile places with low economic opportunities. What we're essentially arguing here is we need to step away, and we need to let the people of the G5 and the people of the AU and the people of ECOWAS fight this battle, because our presence in the region is only making matters worse and only making it easier for terrorist organizations to recruit and have higher numbers in their ranks. With that, I see nothing but vote in affirmation.
Before I begin, I'd like to thank the Air Force Academy so much for hosting us here and for this awesome opportunity to grow as intellectuals and have a debate. So, are you ready? We're going to start with defining 3 key terms in the resolution we are debating today. First is North Africa. North Africa is defined as Algeria, Egypt, Libya, Morocco, Sudan, Tunisia, and Western Sahara. This is according to numerous sources, and if you do any Google search, this is what it's going to give you. Don't let them broaden this definition to all of Africa, because that leads to a loose debate that isn't focused on the academia that we research. Second, U.S. military presence is defined as by the National Military Strategy is the strategic placement of U.S. military forces overseas and the infrastructure and pre-positioned equipment necessary to sustain them in and near key regions. Of note, this includes emplacement of all 4 key branches of the military, thus the affirmative must endorse a strategy of reduction that includes reducing the presence of all 4 branches. And then 3, according to the Senate Republican Policy Committee in 2015, reduction in U.S. military forces is defined as a 20% reduction in troops. There are 2 key reasons to vote negative on why we should not decrease military presence in North Africa, but rather increase our efforts to repress terrorism and authoritarian regimes. These two reasons are Russian encroachment and the subsequent feeding of terroristic regimes, and European migration and human trafficking. If the U.S. military pulls out, a vacuum is created, despite what the affirmative says. A vacuum likely to be filled by entities hostile to Western interests generally, and the U.S. specifically. These agents include jihadi Salafi terrorist groups and Russia. Within this speech, I will break down Russia's influence in the two key North African countries. Each one is an individual reason to vote negative. A, Libya. Nowhere is Russia's growing influence in the region more apparent than in Libya. When Muammar Gaddafi was killed in 2011, Russia lost billions of dollars in armed contracts with Libya, which were 12% of the Kremlin's arms exports in 2010. They also had hundreds of millions of dollars invested in oil and gas exploration, as well as access to the Benghazi port. In order to reclaim those markets, Russia is undermining the US, UN, and NATO-supported civilian government of national accord in Libya and actively courting military commander Khalifa Haftar, who controls the oil-rich eastern part of the country and seeks to take over Libya with his Libyan National Army. Furthermore, Russia has had private security forces operating in a region held by Haftar, proving it has a strong physical presence in the region and is working hand-in-hand with Haftar's violent regime. The U.S. has also observed Russian Special Operations Forces and drones at Sidi Barani in Egypt, about 60 miles from the Egypt-Libya border. This is especially troublesome because Haftar's regime is a violent, authoritarian one that threatens to destabilize not only democracy and stability in Libya, but the very structure of governance, proliferating into Europe and the West. Russia's abuse in the region came to a culmination in May 2016, when Moscow printed nearly 4 billion Libyan dinars for Libya's central bank and transferred the money to a branch loyal to Haftar in a profoundly destabilizing move, sabotaging the unity government by flooding the country with conflicting currencies that are not interchangeable in banks. When the affirmative claims that we should withdraw from the region, look to the testimony before the Senate Armed Service Committee by General Waldhauser, who described Russia's influence in Libya as very concerning. They are on the ground. They are trying to influence the action. We watch what they do with great concern. General Waldhauser went on to say the instability in Libya and North Africa caused by years of political infighting may be the most significant near-term threat to U.S. and allies' interests on the continent. Stability in Libya is a long-term proposition. We must maintain pressure on the ISIS-Libya network and concurrently support Libya's efforts to reestablish legitimate and unified government. The U.S. military presence in the region is one of only a few mitigating factors in the way of Russia's steady encroachment on the region. Withdrawing our presence is the exact opposite of what we should be doing, which is increasing our presence and providing the securitization of GNA that the GNA needs to maintain democracy. The affirmative's isolationist principles jeopardizes the sovereign integrity of Libya and poses a direct threat to U.S. hegemony. According to testimony from Brian Katulis, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, explains that the sum total of Russia's efforts since 2015 has been to reinforce the two negative trends harmful to long-term U.S. strategic interests across the region: the evolution of terrorist threats and increased authoritarianism. What's your question?
You act like 6,000 people are the only people holding back this floodgate of terrorism and instability. It's not like we're an occupying force in the region. It's not much of a power vacuum.
So you bring up a couple of mitigating arguments about how you bring up the G6 the army that's being formed, but the fact is those 6,000 troops that are currently stationed in Africa are the people training the African forces to fight against terrorism. And that's something the affirmative is not accounting for in their argumentation. Those 6,000 troops bring with it the education, the knowledge, the diplomacy, and the securitization that the American forces can provide to African countries. Moving on to the second country, Algeria. Last March, Russian and Algerian officials together shattered a champagne bottle over the first two Black Hole submarines built by Russia for the Algerian Navy. On October 10, 2017, Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev visited Algeria, where he met with Algerian Prime Minister Ahmed Ouyahia. Medvedev said that Russia is ready to offer Algeria its technology and technical solutions to establish a national nuclear industry, as well as to develop cooperation in other spheres. In April 2016, Algerian arms deals brought Russia $7.5 billion. In the period of 2016 to 2020, Russia is to supply 190 tanks, 42 combat helicopters, and 2 submarines to Algeria. Going back to their point, either we provide that arms and that material in a way that promotes democracy and stability, or Russia does it, feeding on the instability and building upon it. Any decrease in military presence in Algeria enables Russia to feed the militaristic regimes present there, using and capitalizing on instability from terrorist organizations that it works hand in hand with to destabilize government in the region and exploit Algeria for economic and geopolitical gains. Thus, voting affirmative in this round endangers not only Algeria and liberty, but the United States as well. It feeds terrorism and actively undermines U.S. hegemony. The second reason to vote negative is migration and human trafficking. If the U.S. military pulls out, increasing instability and insecurity in the region will fuel increased migration into Europe, further bolstering an already thriving $150 billion per year human trafficking industry that exploits the most vulnerable, exacerbating an already massive human rights crisis and destabilizing Europe. This industry feeds off of the instability in the governments of North African countries, the United States military securitization of trade routes, localities, and national governments, as well as the training we provide to local armies, police forces, etc., are poised to take down the human trafficking industry. But Russia's strategy of profiteering off of instability and feeding it through the fueling of authoritarian regimes will only perpetuate and expand the humanitarian crises. The affirmative strategy is one that ignores and invisibilizes the human trafficking, reifying its structure in modernity. Finally, here are 3 points the affirmative must be able to answer to even begin making their advocacy. First, let's not fall into this fallacy that they make about mission creep, right? North Africa, let's not fall into the fallacy of calling changes in North Africa mission creep. The mission remains unchanged: to disrupt and neutralize transnational threats, protect U.S. personnel and facilities, prevent and mitigate conflict, and build African partner defense capabilities and capacity to promote regional security, stability, and prosperity. When they make their argumentation about mission creep, what is noticeable there is that they never address what the original mission was. It is impossible for the affirmative to claim that we are no longer following the mission if they don't explain what the mission is in the first place. This mission that AFRICOM set out when they began placing troops and infrastructure into Africa is exactly what we're following today. Just the environment that we're in has adapted. Which brings me also to the argument on terrorism and the fueling of terrorism. At best, this argument is about a correlation and not a causation. At the same time that the U.S. is getting involved in Africa and stabilizing the democracies there through training in the AFRICOM, Russia is also seeding instability in the region. So at the end of the day, the affirmation is misattributing certain terrorist organizations in Africa to the U.S. when it's a correlation, not a causation, and they can't account for Russia.
We're going to go ahead and agree. We're talking mostly about those countries that they define, particularly when we're talking about Western Sahara. And then moving on to military presence, we do agree that we're going to be decreasing all 4 branches. That's totally fine. And we obviously meet their minimum of 20% reduction when we're reducing forces in today's round. Okay, moving on to their first point about Russian encroachment. The first thing we're going to see is that this is actually a reason to stay less involved in these regions. You can look to the fact, when we look at the example of Syria, that we have avoided escalating situations and escalating military operations in Syria because we wanted to avoid direct conflict with Russia. There are other and better ways to get around this that don't involve putting United States military members at risk with a direct war with Russia or with escalating violence with Russian forces. And then when they talk about, particularly with Libya, they're talking about how Russia is undermining the United States and the legitimate government right there. First of all, this is not a nationally recognized legitimate government right here. We looked at this as one of the many conflicts that Ryan talked about where you have different sides where people have not come to consensus. Right now, Libya is not a war where we are fighting for a single government against other groups. We're seeing that since the removal of Gaddafi, there have actually been multiple sides that have come up, and this is a multi-sided conflict. This is something that the United States particularly should stay out of because there is no good guy to fight for. While we do know that terrorism is bad, that terrorist groups are something that we should fight against, there's no single government that we should put in place to replace them, making it particularly dangerous and linking into our examples of mission creep where we are overextending the mission of the United States. The next thing that we have to see is that we don't have an occupying force in Libya. So they act like the United States' involvement there is really making a change. Right now, like we said, we have 1,000 troops in the North Africa region, 6,000 troops on the continent as a whole. The United States is not doing anything in the status quo, which is what Army is representing today. We're saying that we're going to reduce the number of troops. There's nothing in the status quo which shows that we're doing enough to stop Russia in that manner to actually even create stability in Libya. The other thing that we have to look to is the fact that President Trump has only deployed and affirmed 5 U.S. diplomats to the entire continent of Africa. That's 5 diplomats for 54 nations. If the United States is serious about backing legitimate governments in Africa, there are better ways to do that, and one of the ways that we have to do that is increase our diplomacy first. There's no reason to increase tensions, to escalate violence, and to increase our military presence, or to continue our military presence if we're not willing to put in the work to support legitimate governments. Yes, your question.
How can we increase diplomacy if we don't have the security to go with that?
All right, so first of all, like we see that it's not a priority for the United States in order to do that. We see that number 2 right there, the U.S. military isn't going to be capable of creating this stability. If the United States military was going to be doing this, we would have already backed the government, gone in with force and done this. But we can see that right now the United States is kind of in this zone where we don't really know who we're fighting for, who we're supporting in the region, and how we're going to create this stability. And so at that point, we can't establish any kind of security if there are no good guys in Libya to fight for. All right, moving on to Algeria with their Russia example. We can see, first of all, none of this is unique. The United States is already there in the status quo, and yet Russia is still doing all these deals with them. So this is something that doesn't make a lot of sense. They show how Russia is offering them tech, building them submarines, offering them military aid. And then they're saying we should respond by putting United States military members in Algeria. Like, this doesn't necessarily make sense. If we are going to see any improvement with Algeria, we can see it would best be done by offering our alternatives, which is having the United States go in, offer those deals with weapons, offer to build that technology, offer to create those bonds with Algeria. And that's something that me and Ryan uniquely get on our side, where we pull out U.S. military forces as a crutch for Algeria, and we continue to promote them and support them through these other means, such as funding and building them technology. It's more particularly on the United States, or the Air Force side, where we have more funds and more ability to go about actually building up these relations and building up this technology bonds with Algeria, that we're going to see a real decrease in the encroachment of Russia in the region. And then finally, we can see with the human trafficking and migration. Like, first of all, look at what Ryan was saying, where we don't really have anything in the region to do this already, and we can see that we don't have a significant force that pulling out is actually going to decrease our efforts against these groups. Like we said, there are only 1,000 United States troops in the entire portion of North Africa. And we can see that there are other groups that are coming around right now to do this. We can look at Nigeria has been very successful at creating internal changes in their military to fight against Boko Haram, human trafficking, and the kinds of problems that they've been facing in Nigeria. This is key because we look at this as ownership by Nigeria. They've been able to go from one of the least secure nations in Africa to one of the more secure nations in the region. We can look to the G5 group that he's talked about in the Sahel region that has come together with funding and has created an initial force of 5,000 troops that will be able to fight terrorism in the region. And just right now, they are gaining speed because they were only created in July. Right now is a unique time where as they're coming to their strength, the United States has a key opportunity to pull out without needing this kind of power vacuum. We have a new power coming into its fullness as we have this opportunity to step out. This is something that can uniquely solve this human trafficking without requiring continual United States presence. And then once again, we can also see that this actually leads to, it ties into our contention too about fueling terrorism. When we have continued United States presence, we're actually leading to increases in violence, and that's something that we can see that we've only had destabilizing factors in the region. Now moving on to a couple of my arguments. Contention one, the only thing that they said is that we didn't define the mission at the beginning. And then they defined it that we were to disrupt international terrorist groups and create security for the rest of the world. But the funny thing is, since the United States has entered Africa, the problem has only gotten worse. We brought evidence from the Army War College study showing how in 2000, when the United States first went in, and then in 2008, when AFRICOM got started, we had a handful of missions compared to what we have. And there were 0 terrorist groups outside of Somalia. That's something that's radically changed when we can look to the rise of Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda in Africa. These are things that actually show that the longer we stay in there and the harder we try against them, we're leading to more terrorism in the region. And so when we look to particularly the impacts of our first contention, we're going to see that this is going to lead to a continual war like we see in Afghanistan, where we don't have an end goal, where we don't have a strategy, where we're they said this, we're going to continue to disrupt international problems. This leads to the possibility of a future where America never gets out, where we're a permanent force in the region. And this leads to hundreds of deaths over the years as countless Americans come home in body bags every month, as we have to have this force to stabilize. We're telling you right now, with the different groups that are coming to power in North Africa, we have a unique position and a unique opportunity to get out of North Africa and no longer require permanent United States troops to be in there. And then they talk about they didn't answer our contention on fueling terrorism. They said that Russia was going to spread instability, but I've answered that contention on their own. And let's just look to the fact that contention 2, particularly with that War College study from the Army, we can see that there's actually been the reverse impact that we wanted with our continuing counterterrorism measures. We see that as we go through, this is a unique situation where people in Africa are more likely to side with people, even if they're terrorists from their own continent, than to side with people from the United States. And we can see this is what to hundreds of groups, or hundreds of people joining terrorism in the region, and these countless groups popping up. And for all these reasons, we urge a vote in the affirmative. Thank you.
At large in the region. As argued by both AFRICOM and the United Nations, the United States military forces are needed in North Africa to create regional stability and larger international peace. This summer, at a UN counterterrorism conference, the chair of the Counterterrorism Committee noted the region's instability was compounded and perpetrated by terrorist groups. The chair of the ISIL and Al-Qaeda Committee shared their concerns as recent news has been shown that ISIL leader Abu al-Baghdadi has called on ISIS members to relocate to Libya and support the fight. While losing Sirte was a setback for ISIS to control the region, the group has continued to adapt and relocate. There remains a clear network of cells in the region loyal to Al-Qaeda and willing to support ISIS on a tactical and mission set level, and that will continue into the future. I offer this background just to show that terrorist networks at large are very strong in the region. In the same UN conference, the head of the Committee on Terrorism specifically pleaded for U.S. support, saying the recent increases in terrorist operations have made their presence more crucial than ever. The United Nations has asked its Security Council to meet 3 clear goals for their military support, and you can apply these goals I'm about to give you to the mission creep arguments that my opponents brought up. 1. Building unified security services in Libya. 2. Enhancing regional information sharing in order to strengthen border control. And 3. Monitoring the link between human trafficking networks and terrorist trafficking. These are 3 manageable goals that can be met by U.S. presence in the region, and are a reason why there is an actual mission creep. Please.
You give us these goals, but what's the exit strategy? Because it sounds like you're talking about an indefinite, protracted war.
Great, so these goals are right here, and so when we look at how we accomplish them, it's proportional to the success that we find in each of those goals. So as the U.S. does better, reducing human trafficking, at the same time the U.S. can reduce the special forces that are in the region right now, and I'll detail that later in the speech as well. The United States military has masterfully met these goals through sending small elite units into the region, like my partner was saying, and the affirmative team wasn't able to articulate. They have successfully trained the state security forces while taking no U.S. casualties and using minimal defense funding. Specific tasks regional security forces have been taught are advancing the criminal justice system through specialized counterterrorism training, counterterrorism financing and communication technologies, improving investigation prosecutorial techniques, and supporting the overall development of national terrorism strategies and facilitating its implementation. So I think right here you can see a bunch of reasons why U.S. presence is not only needed, but is being successful in the region right now. And so by using small and controlled elite units to go and influence the security... Oh, go ahead.
All right. How can you say that there's been success in the United States military in the region? We've only seen an increase in the number of terrorist groups and the number of terrorists in the region.
I'll answer your question. So I think if you looked at terrorism at large within the world, terrorism at large has increased since 2000 when your report came out. And so that's probably a pretty good reason why terrorism in the region has increased also. But I think if you look to the U.S.'s particular successes, such as Sirte and Libya, where they're able to actually decimate an ISIS stronghold, that'd be a really specific reason how the U.S. has actually enhanced its ability in the region. Furthermore, I want to talk about now why withdrawing the U.S. from this region would cause it to lose its powerful stance in the U.S. Security Council. Furthermore, the United States withdrawing its current support would not only undo any progress it's made for regional stability, but would harm the United States' position within the United States, within the UN Security Council. Representatives from both Libya and the United Nations have clearly mandated that members of the Security Council will use counter-terrorist strategies. Directly contradicting this guidance would cause the U.S. to lose precious diplomatic sway within the organization. This is particularly crucial as Russia and China are currently pushing the Security Council to further encroach on previously set international human rights. Russia has been insistently attempting to make the United Nations deploy the Syrian government responsible for chemical attacks in the country this past April, and both China and Russia recently prevented the Security Council from condemning the horrific rape and massacres of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. U.S. presence needs to be at its strongest within the Council in order to ensure the United Nations uses its power to condemn Syria and Myanmar's immoral behavior and create the proper standards of human rights and legal order abroad. This influence will be sapped if the United States directly contradicts a United Nations mandate in North Africa, particularly as both China and Russia are fully engaged. Now I want to go back to my partner's previous argument on human trafficking. Ending terrorism in the region, as I showed before, in the clear, succinct ways that the UN Security Council has laid out, will also end human trafficking. A report that was recently given to the UN Security Council said that a modern-day slave trade is now booming in Libya due to the political, military, and social conditions. According to International Organization for Migration, more than 70% of migrants from North Africa to Europe have experienced exploitation, human trafficking, mostly happening in Libya. Terrorist groups, including the Islamic State, are the biggest perpetrators, rampantly engaging in enslavement and forced labor. While human trafficking should be an altruistic concern of any nation, it's actually particularly relevant to the United States' security interests. Ending terrorism is the quickest method to ending the instability in the borders that causes this human trafficking to happen in the first place. As these terrorist groups are able to cause instability in the region and allow mass migration through the different countries in North Africa, they create a fertile ground for the terrorist groups to recruit from that further exacerbates the harms that the United States is trying to end. Now going into rebut some of the arguments that were brought up in the last speech. So I think I mentioned in the cross-section, they say that we don't have an end goal and there's going to be mission creep in the region. I think when you look to the clear resolutions that are set out by the UN Security Council on why this isn't going to happen, as a way you can evaluate what the US should be doing in the region. And so if you have clear goals set up by the UN, then there's no reason why there's actually going to be mission creep in the region as well. Furthermore, what would mission creep actually look like? When the US right now is only sending in small elite units and isn't in camp in the region as the opponent says, what is the actual impact of this mission creep? Where does it happen? And it's not really articulated by the affirmative team. And then they go into this, you can call it risk rate, I guess, about, American blood being shed in the soil, hundreds of Americans dying every month, body bags coming home. So if you go to our definition of what North Africa is, which is given by the United Nations, so it's probably the definition that you should prefer, that doesn't include Niger. And so the 4 deaths that the opponent brings up shouldn't count in this resolution. But even if you do, there have only been 4 US deaths in a region where civilians have been massacred by authoritative rulers. So, I know it's never the purpose of the U.S. military to lose its soldiers, but there's a certain cost-benefit analysis in any war, and it seems like that's been appropriately assessed in North Africa up to this point. And this goes down into the Russia spreading argument that the affirmative misses as well. And so my partner speaks specifically how this is happening in Libya and then Algeria, and how I talk about it specifically on the National Security Council as well. When they don't articulate how this withdrawal is going to happen, how are they going to eliminate these current networks that are happening between Russia and other countries, then we don't get a clear articulation then of how Russia's presence is going to be stopped in the region to begin with. And so this brings me to my concluding point. General Wadhauser, chief of AFRICOM, said 2 of AFRICOM's 5 primary lines of effort, specifically in the context of issues in North Africa. The first is to degrade violent extremist organizations and contain instability in Libya. And the second is to build peacekeeping, humanitarian assistance, and the disaster response of African partners. Reducing military presence in North Africa will result in a failure of both of these goals of AFRICOM at large. When you decide you'd like to vote for this end of the debate, you don't have to decide with the West Point team, but you can look to the analysis and the strategy that are given by both the United Nations and by AFRICOM, but why they specifically insist that the United States needs to stay in the region to combat all the harm that me and my partner have previously brought about. Compare that to the affirmative argument, that the real costs we're saving are spending, but they don't articulate how much the U.S. is spending in the region, or deaths, when we don't get an articulation of how deaths would escalate in the first place, and they can only give us an example of 4 in the past, and the impact seems clear that the U.S. should stay.
I think there are some general framing issues with the affirmative in the context of our role in Africa. When we started researching this topic, we started with the AFRICOM posture statement published in 2017, which outlines exactly what our purpose is in the region. And I'd like to read a couple quotes from there. 1, capable and sustainable defense institutions are critical in providing a secure environment for deepening of democracy and broad-based development, which together can diminish some of the factors that attract vulnerable persons into violent extremism and criminality. And then 2, in an effort to counter regional instability, Africa Command supports partners like Tunisia, a major non-NATO ally. Africa Command is assisting the Tunisian military to develop and sustain special forces, border security capabilities, and Tunisia's intelligence capability. The issue here with the affirmation is they keep on asking questions about an exit point. And that's the issue. AFRICOM is substantially different than other military endeavors that the United States has taken because our placement there is very diplomatic. We put military troops in there to secure things like trade routes, to train military forces and local governments, like the G5 that they also bring up. And as a result, I don't think we should be looking for an exit point. We should be looking for a long-term diplomatic relationship between North African countries and the United States. So the notion of an exit point is flawed. This brings me on to some of their arguments, right? They conceded our definitions, but within that, they also concede that military presence includes infrastructure. And that means they're conceding that they're withdrawing the infrastructure as well. As I brought up in my previous speech, this infrastructure is pivotal in securing the trade routes, which goes straight to their Russian argument about how if we can withdraw, we can then trade with the region, which would benefit everybody. This is flawed because we need the security and the infrastructure set up by our current presence in there to ensure that that trade is stable. Next, they talk about good guys and bad guys, and they say that there is no good guy and bad guy, that it's a tumultuous area of indecision, right? The issue here is if you go to the AFRICOM statement, it makes it clear that we support the Libyan GNA, which is a democratic government that we are endorsing and that we are democratizing through a process, right? And so it goes to show that there are good guys and bad guys, and that's also a framing issue. There are two reasons to vote for negative in this round. One is a reduction in U.S. military presence creates a vacuum in North Africa that will be filled by Russia and their consequent physical, economic, and social expansion into Libya, Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. Current U.S. policy operating through AFRICOM employs a diplomatic strategy to empower local governments. However, those civilian solutions cannot happen without the combination of military procedures and security. Go to what we were talking about Russia's influence in Libya. And the key thing between the efforts of Russia and the effort of the United States is that Russia feeds off of instability in the region. When there's economic turmoil, when you have terrorist groups that are pressing against the current regime and the current authoritarian state in the region, Russia can profit economically through trade, like we demonstrate in the Algeria example through the trade of military, right? What's different about the United States is that we profit off of security instead. The AFRICOM posture explains how the relationship we are building with Africa is long-term, and the stability that results from it is what creates the economic ties that benefit from us. Pulling out of the region right now would be disastrous for it because it enables the spread of terrorism and authoritarian regimes that work hand in hand with Russian interests, increasing violence and death in Africa, and that rise in terrorism places America itself at risk. The second reason to vote negative is on that migration to human trafficking, which they're conceding. They also fail to address the fact that the rise in terrorism is a correlation. Terrorism has risen generally in the world as a whole, which means that the United States cannot be pinned as responsible for that. Thus, we need to analyze current policies, which proves that the United States' current policy is pushing back on the terrorism and democratizing the region. Pulling out creates the vacuum that they can't account for and they can't solve for Russia.
John and I think that the biggest problem with the opposition bench so far in this debate is that they have an extremely high level of hubris and overconfidence in what we are actually doing in North Africa. This is magnified by the last speech when he goes directly onto this framing argument where he says that AFRICOM, talks about AFRICOM's mission and says that it's so important but only brings it up in his last speech and not the rest of the debate. We think that this is important because it shows that he's saying that we only should care about Algeria and Libya in this debate and other the very, very north part of African nations. In those areas, there's not even, there's less than 1,000 American personnel in the area. This is why John gives you the framing that he does. Because of the 6,000 that we talk about in this debate on the entire continent, there's 1,000 that are under our definition of what's North Africa. We think that's an actual substantial debate in this round. We think that that's what we should really be talking about because that's where the news is today. And so that's what we need to really talk about when we're talking about their framing. More than that, let's go in directly to our time frame, magnitude, and probability reasons to vote for this for that affirmative in this round. We think under time frame, we have to look at how they actually concede that this is going to be long-term and protracted. That's a major impact in this round. He says that we shouldn't even be looking towards some type of exit strategy, that we should consider some long-term involvement at an indefinite time frame viewpoint. We think that this is substantial because this means that these goals that he sets up that says that AFRICOM has are, first of all, immeasurable. You cannot actually measure the things that he brings up in his final speech of the framing of AFRICOM's mission. And this is why we hammer home that the no exit strategy is so damning. Because no one ever talks about a protracted war like it was great and a great victory for the United States. This is why people think that like a lot of our action in Afghanistan is becoming increasingly harmful. This is why people reference like Vietnam as like a harmful war and with harmful impacts. Because once you do allow for mission creep and once you allow for these long-term goals to spiral out of control, you only allow for more destruction in the region. Now, let's look down under magnitude. When we talk about magnitude, we have to talk about two things: terrorist acts and terrorist recruitment. And finally, like under terrorist acts, we have to talk about like the threat to the United States. Because it seems like their case is predicated a lot on the actual threats to the United States. And they never actually combat the argumentation that we get right out of the gate in our first speech, where we talk about how these are regional terrorist organizations with no aims of attacking the United States. There isn't really a security threat in the region. Largely, there's only an economic threat in the region, and this is what they point out in their case. They only build a case around like economic encroachment from Russia. We think that that's pretty damaging as far as like who's going to win this round today when we're actually talking about magnitude. Under terrorist recruitment as well, and under magnitude, we have to look at how we have actually made matters worse. They never refute that like our argumentation that we think that terrorist organizations have less recruitment when you have less of a United States presence. We think that this is a war that needs to be fought by the northern like Africans. We think that like this is a war that can only be won by them because of the unique way that we actually damage the situation just by our mere presence in the region. They never go against our articulation that we give you that it is much easier for a terrorist to join up with Boko Haram or join up with Al-Shabaab rather than join up with the United States or the like establishment within the region, because we are seen as outsiders. We're seen as disruptors. Although our intentions are very good, we're seeing that outcomes are very, very bad. We're seeing that mission creep is real, that when we move into our probability arguments about mission creep in the vacuum and about human trafficking, we said that mission creep is extremely probable. When you don't have an exit strategy, that is mission creep by definition. And we think that that is extremely damaging. They say that we never articulate what the like long-term problems with mission creep actually are, but we give it to you in our first speech. We talk about how it's going to lead to an increased presence, that as more Americans start to get killed overseas, there's going to be more support because we think that like the American populace will see that we have invested blood, and that this will mean that we will only increase our involvement in the nation, and so we will start to have more and more Americans coming home like killed or injured. And we think that that is a problem when we don't have any type of actual substantial measurable goals, because the goals they give you are immeasurable in nature. They are not something that we can actually form an exit strategy around or a victory around. Finally, this idea of a vacuum. We don't think a vacuum is actually going to exist. First of all of the argumentation that they give with Russia and China is non-unique. It is happening in the status quo with the United States presence there. So if we pull out, it's probably still going to happen on the same trajectory. More than that, we aren't giving some type of a power vacuum. There are groups like the G5 and ECOWAS that they never refute as being independent from the United States government.